Books and Books in Coral Gables. Thank you all for coming down for this very special event. As you can see from these lights and these cameras, we're live streaming the event on the internet this evening, so a note for our internet audience at home. If at any time during the presentation you'd like to purchase a copy of the book, just call the number on your screen. We will take care of that for you. We will have the author sign it, and we'll ship it wherever you are in the United States free of charge. This evening, Books and Books is very happy to welcome Ms. Myra McPherson and her new book, The Scarlet Sisters, Sex, Suffrage, and Scandal in the Gilded Age. Is it me saying it or the title itself? I'm not sure which it's all well. I have to share some credit with Myra. Ms. McPherson is the award-winning and best-selling author of 4 previous books, including The Power Lovers, the Vietnam War classic Long Time Passing, and All Governments Lie. She was an acclaimed journalist at the Washington Post and has also written for the New York Times and numerous magazines and websites. In this book, Ms. McPherson brings us a fresh look at the life and times of Victoria Woodhull and Tenny Claflin, 2 sisters whose radical views on sex, love, politics, and business threatened the white male power structure of the 19th century and shocked the world. Vividly telling their story, she brings these inspiring and outrageous sisters brilliantly to life. Please give a very warm welcome to Ms. Myra McPherson.
I'm supposedly wired for sound. You know, Bill Dunlap, one of my dear friends over here, an artist, when I did my last book, it was on a man named I.F. Stone, and he used to joke and say, "Is there any sex in this? Is there any sex in this?" And I said, "You got to have some sex in this." And I said, "It won't sell if you don't." So in his honor, I did Sex and Scandal on that.
Oh, can I get a witness?
You know, I really hate public speaking. You know, it used to make me so incredibly nervous. I still am, but I got a lesson once when I was speaking to a group, rather large group, and there was this woman in the front, and she just, nothing. Everyone was smiling, other people looking attentive, and she just looked like this. So I found myself playing to her. All of you who remember Jack, my wonderful Jack Gordon, used to say he'd get 95% of the vote. He'd always wonder, who the hell were the other 5%, you know? And that was the way I was playing to this woman, because everybody else was being kind of nice and listening and everything. And so finally I got so angry at the end when the Q&A, I said, well, you know, maybe this woman in front would like to say something. And the woman next to her said, oh, she's from Germany. She hasn't understood a word you said. So if I don't get any response, I know why. You're all from another country. And this actually does tie in, believe it or not, with the Scarlet Sisters, because they became the most incredible female lecturers of their time, speaking to 6,000 and more on all these subjects that we will get to. But at the beginning, they both almost fainted when they started to speak. And I kept thinking, well, you know, maybe it's it was just an interesting story to see that they, after developing this amazing skill and being able to speak without any mic, you know, without anything, behind gas lights and just one little person on a huge stage. And when Tenny, the youngest, was 64, she had a sold-out crowd of 7,000 twice at Royal Albert Hall. So they were really an amazing duo. And people ask me, you know, how I got interested in them. And the main beginning of it was in 2008, when everybody was saying that there's a possible historic ticket of a white woman and an African-American male, i.e. Clinton and Obama. And so I read this little squib that said it had been done before, 133 years before. In 1872, when Victoria Woodhull ran on this remote third-party ticket with Frederick Douglass, the former slave and orator. So I said, well, I got to find out more about that. And then I found out about her sassy younger sister, Tenny, who she was just totally she was like an untamed colt. You know, anything she said or did was just out there very fast. Anyway, so when she ran for president, Tenney ran for Congress, and their argument was that nothing in the Constitution said anything against a woman running for office. This was 50 years before the vote. And they fought for equality in the boardroom, the bedroom, and even on the battlefield. Tenney Claflin became the first woman, and probably the only woman, to be the colonel of a regiment of the African American New York Regiment. And so before I get into how their similarities are today, I do want to say who they were, because this was an era when women had no power. They couldn't leave a marriage if they wanted to. If they got a divorce, they couldn't get the children. They were stratified in the way of the upper class and then middle class and lower class. And they came from the trashiest background possible. Their father was a con artist, snake oil man, who put them into fake fortune telling at a very young age. At the age of 11, Tenney was telling fake fortunes for 13 hours at a stretch. And they both just climbed out of this horrible background and an abusive family situation and decided that they wanted to have power and they wanted to have freedom. And they just pursued it with a kind of pursuit that very few people would have, and certainly women. And they were very beautiful, and they were great self-promoters. And the first thing they had to do was to get known before they could run for president or Congress. So the very first of their many firsts was that they became the first women to own a brokerage firm on Wall Street. And they were bankrolled. That didn't happen again for another 100 years, I might add. And they were bankrolled by Cornelius Vanderbilt, the richest man in America, who was known to be the lover of Tenney. At least all the books say that, and I don't want to abuse anybody of that. I think that's a good idea. Anyway, but they got to him because he believed in spiritualism, and they were clairvoyants, and they were, decided that they could. I think there was a genuine force in what they could do, but also a lot of fake involved. And they kept convincing him that they would be sure to get his long dead mother talking to him. I don't know if that ever happened, but they managed to get this stockbrokerage firm, and it was so amazing that more than 2,000 stockbrokers came out just to see them on opening day. They came in and they dressed alike. They were 7 years apart in age, but they had it all planned. They even had 2 gold pens, pure gold pens behind each ear. They cut their hair short. They were just audacious in everything they did. And so after that, they kept on going, and Victoria became the first woman ever to address Congress, and it was over the vote. And she was trying to prove that because the Constitution said citizen, and because it said people, and because nowhere except in the 14th Amendment does it ever say male vote. And that was sort of a throwaway in the Second Amendment of the 14th Amendment, the second article, which was to was to make sure that no African American women could vote, and that was really the reason for it. So up till then, there hadn't been anything. So they argued, and she went to speak before Congress, almost fainting, as I said, and gave this really enormously intelligent concept of why women should not be able to get the vote. And of course, all the male congressmen just shot it down. And when she was talking to one of them, she said, I'm a citizen. And he said, Madam, you are not a citizen. And she said, well, what am I? And he said, you are a woman. And so for the next 50 years, whatever kind of citizens women were, they couldn't get the vote. And then they started a radical newspaper and became these fiery lectures, shocking audiences of up to 6,000 with their views on divorce, prostitution, religion, race, financial and political corruption, sex in and out of marriage. And they decided that upper crust women who married for money were practicing legalized prostitution. And I mean, their guts and their absolute chutzpah, to do everything. In fact, they knew how to reshape a story. The New York Times wrote a blistering piece about them and said it seems unbelievable two women of this sort could be in one family. So they just excised that part and said, and the New York Times praises us as it seems unbelievable that these I mean, we could all take lessons from these women. And they loved communists and capitalists alike. They joined they were the first and only women to join the Karl Marx's International Working Men's Association. And it was so popular that it was called the Yankee International. And the sisters said, okay, we're going to make this. It was their version of the Rainbow Coalition. They let women in, they let blacks in, they let anybody else in, and all the poor people. And Karl Marx, who thought they were great at first, just threw a fit and expelled them. And the sisters just said, oh, he's nothing but a fallen despot. And the important thing is that historians say no matter what happened, that they actually promoted racial equality the most since abolition by their movements. One was by running with Frederick Douglass. The other one was being the colonel of the army and everything. And as I said, above all, they railed against Victorian hypocrisy regarding sex. And as they were free lovers, which could mean anything from just wanting to reform these horrible divorce laws to having the choice of, believe it or not, of somebody that you wanted to marry and whether or not you had children. And that was considered absolutely impossible in those days. And then finally, they blew the whistle on Henry Ward Beecher's adulterous affair, and they just blasted it. And I know it goes on. I'm sorry. And they just blasted him in print, and they also accused a man of having raped a virgin at the masked ball in their weekly, and they got thrown into prison for obscenity by a man named Comstock, who was a horrible man. I'm glad somebody knows him. Anthony Comstock was a man who saw sin everywhere. I mean, medical books, drawings in medical books. We're talking a really sick guy. But he did great damage because he became famous over the sisters fight, and until the middle 1920s, his Comstock law was very, very repressive about the First Amendment, repressive about the best books of poetry, George Bernard Shaw, everything. And he also was against contraception and literally drove Margaret Sanger out of the country. So he was a very vicious man, and he not only threw them in prison, they didn't even, for a whole month, they were in prison without any sense of possibly having a trial or anything. And we're not talking about nice prisons. I mean, and they were, and but there were those who made fun of him, and there was a wonderful cartoon of Comstock standing with this woman in front, speaking to a judge, and Comstock said, "Well, Your Honor, this woman just gave birth to a naked baby." And I want to just read a few things that the women said in their own voice, and they had I have 47 cast of characters, and I divide this into acts rather than parts. It's act 1, 2, 3, because their life was like high drama, and they knew everybody from presidents to future kings. They were Harriet Ward Beecher Stowe. Thank you. I always get them all mixed up. She called them tramps, and did a roman à clef about them that was all over the place. And Henry James did. He wrote a book called The Siege of London, and he also patterned one of them for the Bostonians. And so they were these outrageous women, in a time when outrage was quite there for the men. I mean, we're talking about the robber baron era and and it was I do a lot about I'm not going to go into it all here, but I do a lot about the life and times and how interesting it was. There was the Fifth Avenue Hotel had a as they call it, a vertical railway going through every floor, which was an elevator. It was the first elevator ever. And all of these guys would come to police everybody else and police each other on the Hill. I mean, and in Wall Street. And there was one guy, Daniel Drew, who was considered one of the oldest and the meanest, and the story is that once when he was a cattle drover, was leading all of his cattle to be sold, and he told all of his people, just give them a lot of salt, give them a lot of salt. And then he said, he got to the place where they were going to sell them, and he said, give them lots of water, give them lots of water. They drank all the water. That rose their weight and the price he got, and that was the beginning of the phrase watered stock. So, I mean, it's kind of an interesting real background. But he also said the line about he who steals what isn't his and pays it back or goes to prison. But the sisters, I think the only way you're going to get a sense is if I give you just a little bit of what they said. With her piercing blue eyes, Victoria observed life at the Willard Hotel in Washington, watching the after-hours comings and goings of congressmen and lobbyists. And you know the phrase lobbyist came from, does everybody know that? It's an old story. It was said that Grant made it up. He was walking through the lobby of the hotel, the Willard, and all these people were coming up beseeching him, and he says, all these damn lobbyists, and that's how the phrase got started. But anyway, she watched and she observed, and then she later shocked audiences with her observation. Where is prostitution in its greatest luxury? Washington. Everybody knows that the third house, after the Senate and Congress, is in Washington is. It consists of the lobbyists who are there to obtain legislation to push this little scheme or that small appropriation. Lobbyists distributed to brothel madams $10, $15, and even $20,000. To spellbound audiences, Victoria asked why, to secure their influence with representatives and senators. I say it boldly that it is the best men of the country who support the houses of prostitution. We could argue about the best men, but and then they were totally on this concept of the lies and the double standard. And as I say, underneath the Victorian cloak of unctuous morality, sex was everywhere except in the marriage bed. Woodhull argued. She said, marriage, she said, is a license to cohabit sexually. Yet the enforcement of this method eventually defeats the original object. It is the common experience among the married who have lived together strictly according to the marriage covenant for from 5 to 10 years that they are sexually estranged. And she would say this all over the country, and every people would gasp and boo and everything. And they both decried the economic dependency of women that kept them trapped in repugnant marriages. A century and a half before the term date rape and domestic rape were coined, Victoria and Tenney shouted to packed houses about domestic abuse. Night after night, there are thousands of rapes committed under cover of this accursed license, and millions, yes, I say it boldly, knowing whereof I speak, millions of poor, heartbroken, suffering wives are compelled to minister to the lechery of insatiable husbands. And this is the line that I thought was interesting. And knowing the way the laws were, I think she was probably right. Nothing except marriage invests men with the right to debauch women sexually against their will. And Tenney did the whole double standard routine constantly. She said, now I say that the poor prostitute suffering for bread and naked for clothes who sells herself to some man for a few hours to obtain the few dollars with which to procure them and thus sustains her life, or the young maiden involuntarily yielding herself up to him to whom her young heart goes out in purity, is an angel compared to this woman, she was talking about a rich woman, who sold herself to the man she detested for $100,000. But such is the force of public opinion that while the prostitute would be kicked from the doorstep and the unmarried girl who engaged in sex with a man she loved would be turned from her father's home, the designing woman marrying for money is a worshipped belle of New York, a virtuous woman. And the thing that is quite amazing is when you start looking at what they said back then and what is still going on today. As I mentioned, equal pay for equal work, but there are just so many. Like, for example, this one. Excuse me. Society should leave the love affairs of the community to regulate themselves instead of trusting to legislation to regulate them. And I said this is not a modern-day activist cheering the U.S. Supreme Court's 2013 overturning of the Defense of Marriage Act as unconstitutional, but Woodhull in 1871. And this is, put a woman on trial for anything, it is considered as a legitimate part of the defense to make the most searching inquiry into her sexual morality, and the decision generally turns upon the proof advanced in that regard. Again, this is not a contemporary woman speaking of the disparaging treatment of women who try to speak out against somebody who had raped them, and it actually is one of the reasons, that kind of fear, that 54% of rapes go unreported today. And this was Tenney, again, speaking in 1871. And it goes on and on and on. And we have seen what's happened on the Hill with legitimate rape and vaginal probes and everything else. And it's just amazing that the things that they fought for 144 years ago are now having to refight the battle for, just on so many areas, I must say. And I'm going to just let you all ask me some questions, if you have any. I forgot to tell you, there's a great last act, and I'm going to make you read the book. She says coyly. Because they went from rags to riches and then back to rags, and were totally, everybody, their friends had forsaken them. Among them was Katie Stanton, who was absolutely amazing. She really bought the free love package because she herself had wanted to elope with her brother-in-law at one point and was deeply in romantic before her marriage, in which there seemed to be very little romance except a lot of children. And she was there at their side for the longest time, but after they went to prison, everybody just went the other way. And of course the press did everything it could to ruin them. I was lucky to find some personal letters between the sisters later in life, because they put on a great front. They were always not oblivious, but they would fight back. I mean, they fought like men. They fought back because the only rules were men's rules. They threatened blackmail against people who wrote things about themselves. They lied incessantly. They made up themselves. They reinvented who they were. And when things got in a pinch, they just told another story, and they kept on going. But but in their letters, there's a very personal sense of sadness, or at least a sense that they had been persecuted for what they stood for. As all pioneers, I'm sure. Yes.
For the most part, Myra, were they friends all their lives?
Yes, they were the most symbiotic duo I've ever seen. Tenney felt that when Victoria left, she was 7 or 8. She's 7 years older. She left and got married, a very bad marriage, etc. And Tenney always felt lost in that situation. The main question is, were they prostitutes at any point in their life? I've come to the conclusion that they may well have been in that period with their father, because I think he was pimping for two of her the other sisters. And then she felt that she tells the story. There's an incredibly dramatic trial about the family that is in the book. And their crazy mother, as they said, never wholly sane mother, threatened and said that Victoria's then husband was keeping them from her, and that he was threatening to kill her. She was just bonkers, and they had been blackmailed by their own family, so they shut up about everything as long as they could. And when this was exposed, this crazy, trashy family, they started a whole downhill slide when people who had supported them, like Susan B. Anthony and others, stopped. So they were kind of almost ruined by this family over and over. But Tenny said that she would always be grateful to her sister for bringing her out of that horrible life and giving her a life. And they were together for a very long time. And even in the 20s, if one was giving a speech, they would send a letter back to England, where they were.
Was Victoria basically set to an arranged marriage when she married so young and so badly? Well,
one of the things that I say in the beginning of this book is that everything is a morass of speculation, intrigue, some facts, a lot of rumors, things that were written. I mean, she wrote a biographical sketch when she was 31, and in it she just trashes her family terribly. But it was at the time when they were ruining them, so you don't know how much was real or not. But the man who wrote it was Theodore Tilton, who was this Adonis of the suffragist movement. He was gorgeous and 6'3". Anyway, his wife was the one who had the affair with Henry Ward Beecher, and so he was a wonderful free lover until he became cuckolded. Like all men, it was like, hey, this isn't fair. And I say alleged only because, as I say, it was a hung jury. And I've read the transcripts. I read a lot that was written at the time, and I have a lot in the book that really, I think, just nails him. Not just with her, but with several other women. In fact, Victoria used to say he preaches to 16 of his mistresses every Sunday. Yeah. Maggie?
Why do you think it is they've been sort of forgotten by history until...
That's a really good question, and it's an amazing one. When you think of I looked at all the newspapers from the time. There was truly paparazzi time, and they didn't have photos, but they had cartoons and daguerreotypes, and they would have headlines that would say Victoria and Ted for Theodore Tilton. They didn't need any other last names. They were totally celebrities, and including over in Europe. And what happened was that the women's movement just wrote them out of the history of women. There's this huge tome that was written starting in 1882, and Stanton and Anthony and several others, and they mention Victoria's historic moment when she was in Congress speaking to them, but that's all. And so everything that they did, which was so far ahead of everybody else and so highly charged with the sexual concept, was just ignored. And so that, I think, for a long time that happened. Then there would be books that were written. The first book that was written about them was in 1927, and it was I'm the first one to do a dual of this, because most of them just concentrate on Victoria. But that book is full of lies, and they use, like I said, they use things verbatim as if it's accurate, like including her autobiographical sketch, which I say read with a grain of salt, and try to get what was real out of all of that and what was not real. And that book was copied by a lot of people. There's been no other biography in this century, but in the 20th century there were several. And then the women's movement, the rebirth of the women's movement in the 70s, they started doing some writing about them, and now they're on the website quite a bit, and a lot of younger feminists have discovered them. And as I said, their time is now. I mean, they always felt that they were way ahead of their time, and they said, but we have to speak to another generation, and so there you are. Yes, darling.
So how did you begin your research into them? And, you said something about you read their letters and
well,
newspapers.
the answer is torturously.
Yeah. How did you start digging?
Yeah, I started out like a lot of people. You look at the books that have been written, and you look at where their sources came from, and you find those sources. You don't want to take from the book, but you want to find the original sources to find it. And then I found these letters at Carbondale, Illinois, and then I found some at the Boston Public Library. And I had an absolutely wonderful researcher with an incredible name of Terumi Rafferty Osaki. He was adopted, and he's from Japan, and he was just the day that I got on my cell phone what he had sent me, which was an 1872 New York Times article, PDF, with it looking exactly like it did in 1872, I almost fainted. I said, oh my God, we are in such a new world, because when I started, I was having to go, the weekly that they had was not digitized, a lot of stuff was not digitized, but as I was working, all of that burst of changed internet made it possible to find the originals. So I went back to all the original newspapers myself. I looked at them myself. I didn't want to take what somebody else said they had said. And then I found this treasure trove. And then I had the lucky trip of going to Portugal and England to find out. All right, I'll tell you what happened. I can't hold back. Anyway, after they had been absolutely trounced by everybody, they said, in effect, to hell with you. And they went to England, and they married two of the richest men in England and lived happily ever after. And one of them was Sir Francis. So Lady Cook, i.e. Tenny, the screw-around, was Lady Cook for the rest of her life. And she used her money and her publicity to go all over the world pushing for women's suffrage. And as I said, she was speaking until her dying days. Victoria, on the other hand, became weirder and more eccentric, and I think I think about 2 times, and I say this in the book, I think she was very much either having a nervous breakdown or close to it. She was an erratic personality underneath all this extraordinary poise, But to tell you the difference, just explain, Victoria looked like, she was named for the Queen, and so she acted like she was the Queen all the time. And Tenny would come in and just, jostle around. And she said, I love the press. I love the media. They didn't call it media. She said, I love the newspapermen. They're the salt of the earth, and they keep everything from spoiling. They were in Delmonico's, which was this fancy restaurant, of course, in New York, and it had several chains. But at this point, they went in one night after work on the Hill. I keep saying the Hill, Wall Street. Excuse me. And the owner came up and very obsequiously said, "You can't, you girl, you know the rules. You can't be in here after night without an escort." And Tenny had just ordered soup for 2. And so she said, okay. She went out and she got their carriage driver off of his post, dragged him in, sat him down, and said, soup for 3. So she had a lilt to her that I liked. Yeah. Yes.
2 things. Can you draw any lines from their activism to affecting change that was quantifiable in their lifetime, that they could say, we did this?
I don't think you can say in their lifetime, but what it really did was for example, there are some women writers who say that they wrecked the suffrage movement by their being there. They were there for only 2 to 3 years. They did not wreck it. What wrecked it was that they were having huge fights before the sisters ever came in. There was a huge shift came because the abolitionists and the suffragists who had been pals forever got into a fight over whether it should be the Negro's hour or the women's hour. And they all split and had a huge falling out in 69, and then the sisters came on the scene in 70. And so at the time, when they professed what they said to Congress, oh, everybody, Susan B. Anthony, everybody said, why didn't we think of that? This is great. And it did form a large number of women who did vote. They actually said, we can vote. This is just as test cases. And so they were instrumental in that. But what really, I think, happened was about the time of the suffragettes in like 1912. They were considered heroes. They were then older, but they were still considered the heroes of the movement, because by then the suffragists in England were throwing things through glass windows and risking and being force-fed in prisons. And so these sisters were really looked on. And from then on, I think it's just been a gradual thing. And it's not just gradual. My friend Pat Schroeder, who was the longest woman in Congress, said, I love those women. In fact, I quote her quite a bit in the epilogue. And so not in their lifetime, I guess, is what you'd say, but sort of, because they didn't die till 1927 and 1923. So in their later life, they were being much appreciated by them, But hey, I bet everybody in this room of a certain age has a story of sexism, and it's still going on, and it's happening a lot in politics. I mean, Mitch McConnell referred to Grimes, who's running against him, as an empty dress, and Wendy Davis was pilloried by all of those guys, supposedly. I think the funny part was that Tenny and Victoria were trashed for being the equivalent of trailer park trash, and Wendy Davis was trashed for not being trailer park track enough. I mean, you had Karl Rove saying, "Oh my, this woman was only in that trailer for 3 months." I mean, it just, it's really something. Any more questions? Yes.
Was it partially, it makes me feel so sad that these two women ultimately were rejected by women that historically I revere as having made a difference for women's rights in this country. Was that possibly a class structure?
Oh, totally. I mean, not totally.
They were trailer park trash, and
but very much so. I'm glad you brought it up, because
Susan B. Anthony.
Because all of those women were middle class. They were not upper class, but the movement was a minority. It was. They fought the same kind of things that we fought with ERA against Phyllis Schlafly, and things that continue. There are these religious groups that come up, and it was the same then. One of the Beecher sisters, the old spinster, was against women's rights totally, and they came all from that I would say educated background, more so. And here come these two, and I think for a while they were kind of exotic. They were gorgeous, and they were exotic birds to go slumming with, and then when they said too many things, then they absolutely couldn't stand it. Yeah. And of course, a lot of them were in very bad marriages themselves. I mean, she really, they started slamming Victoria, so Victoria wrote a column called Tit for Tat, and she said, she was going to really nail all of these people. And she sent them a proof sheet saying, if you don't lay off me, this is what's going to go in the paper. and that absolutely infuriated Susan B. Anthony. And then she became very strong in her movement to run for the presidency. And she came in at one of their meetings and she was. They came to the surface so fast that within 4 months, the newspapers were calling it Woodhull's Women instead of the other, and so she was very determined to take over. So she goes up and she just races up and starts to give a speech and telling everybody to come over to her place, the other Apollo House instead of Steinway House, to be with her and nominate her, right? And so Susan B. Anthony says, you're out of order, and everyone was screaming and yelling, but Victoria had stacked the room, and so she had all of her people in there, and they were screaming back and forth, and then Susan B. Anthony says, "The heck with this." She goes out, finds a workman, and has him shut off all the gas lights, and so and there is Victoria standing in the dark on the stage, and I mean, from then on, they did not speak to each other. And they were also very good about corruption. They trailed it all with those guys on the robber barons, and then they wrote about it. And of course, all the capitalist newspapers, which all of them were mostly, then trashed them. I mean, they went against all of the big guns. The Beecher dynasty was enormous. The fact that they kind of recklessly said, "This is where we're going," was what fascinated me. Yes.
Well, other than the revelation that there was sex in the 19th century, you seem to have a lot of fun writing this book.
Oh, I hated the writing. I loved the research. I mean, you get it all, and then you say, "Now what am I going to do?" And it bulges out here, and you're there. And I mean, I ended up splitting one chapter into two, and all of that. But I really felt that getting to know them was fun. Yeah.
They're here to stay.
They are. I think now is their time. I mean,
You got a movie deal yet?
we're working on it.
Yeah.
I never say anything until it happens. Anybody else? We all
All right. Thank you very much, Myra. Quick reminder for our internet audience at home, there's still time for you to call the number on your screen. You can purchase a book. We will have it signed for you, and we will ship it to you wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. Another note about our live-streamed events is that they are all archived. So you can visit the Books and Books website, go to the live streaming link, and any event that we broadcast from here in the store will be saved there for you to watch at your convenience. For those of you here in the house, we have the Scarlet Sisters for sale at the counter over there. Myra's going to be signing over here at the table to my left, and that was such a wonderful presentation. Let's please give her another hand. Thanks very much.